Yvonne, there's a thing there, right there. No, yeah, right there, that's right, that's it. Okay, ready? You live? Yep, good. Good morning, everyone. We're now over the break. We're here for the next few weeks. And today we're going to be starting the second set of the Ten Commandments. But let's just give a quick review. We spoke about last time. Last time we did the mitzvah of honoring one's parents. We talked about the famous commentary of the Kli Yakar, who said that it's a recognition. Obviously it's gratitude, but it's also a recognition that we don't come from ourselves. There's a source, something that came before us, which leads us all the way to believe in God and to understand that He's the ultimate source of everything. We talked about how it's not always such an easy mitzvah. It makes sense when you just read it in the sentence, but it's actually not so easy. Sometimes, especially according to the Jewish guidelines. We highlighted the problem of today's society, whether it's in therapy or apparently on social media, which I wasn't aware, how parent alienation is often being encouraged. And that's obviously, unless there's an extreme circumstance, it's really a problem. And the whole connection between that and emunah, and the connection with the 10th commandment, which is not to desire things that other people have, which is forgetting that God is the source of everything, and when we want something or we have something, we have what we meant to have, and we're not supposed to desire what others have, and we'll come back to that when we do the 10th commandment. But for now, that's just a quick review. So today, I want to do the 6th commandment, or the 6th statement, as we said. It's not really commandments, it's statements, which include commandments. And if we have time also to connect it, or to talk a little bit about the 7th commandment. So the 6th commandment is, you shouldn't murder, which is a pretty good idea. And you shouldn't commit adultery. So those two are... Now it's interesting you're smiling, because that's a point actually I wanted to make to begin with. That it seems like a very logical thing. It's a kind of, both of these laws are observed by most people, I believe. And it's something that every society, we would imagine, would come up with it, right? Every society, a functional society would, like for example, there's, in Jewish writings, there's this concept of the 7 Noahide laws, right? Which are universal laws for everyone to keep that create a functional and strong society. And of course, one of them is not murdering and not committing adultery. That's just part of a functional society. That every society, one would imagine, will come up with laws that prevent murder, on some level at least. So why does it need to be the 10 Commandments? Like what? I mean, 10 Commandments, again, were given in a very dramatic way. They're the foundation of the Jewish people. It's got to do with the Sinai revelation, which is really fundamental to Jewish identity. So why include laws that are so obvious? Why don't we get some laws that are a bit more novel and creative and things maybe we wouldn't have thought of ourselves, right? Okay. I mean, the first two, faith, understandable. Shabbat is more of a spiritual mitzvah. We get it, honoring parents, because last time we spoke about how sometimes extremely difficult. We need to understand the clarity of that. Okay. But not to murder, not to commit adultery. But the answer is, there's two answers to this. The first is based on a different question, that generally the question is asked about the 10 Commandments, how come they deal with such simple things, even not stealing and not lying in testimony and things like that? Why does it talk about such simple ideas, right? And the answer to that is that actually it goes to the essence of what the divine revelation at Sinai was all about. Right? And this goes to the heart of Judaism, really, which we've talked about many times. And that is, we have a midrash that is brought very, very often in Hasidic teachings, and that is, what is the purpose of the world? Or why did God create the world, right? He was doing just fine without the world. What do you need the world for, right? And we don't know the ultimate reason. We know what he wanted. We don't know why he wanted it, but we know what he wanted. And the Midrash says that Nit'aveh HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God desired, he had a desire, he had a want to dwell betachtonim, in the lower forms of existence. When we say lower or higher, we don't mean physically. We mean spiritually or metaphorically or in a spiritual sense, right? When we talk about higher and lower in the spiritual sense, what we mean is higher is an existence where God is there's more godly consciousness, there's more divine revelation, there's more awareness of God, or revelation, right? Lower means where God is not so revealed, God is concealed. We are taught in Kabbalah that even some of the lower spiritual worlds, God is more concealed through a Kabbalistic concept which we call tzimtzum. Tzimtzum means he contracts himself, he hides himself in order to create something which is more finite. But it's never as low as this world. This world is a place where unless you learn about it, or unless you believe it, or unless you internalize it, it's a place where God is not revealed at all. Especially not in temple times and in our days and so on, right? So it's very easy to live in this world and miss God. But God wanted to be invited in. He wanted to live in this world. He wanted to manifest himself in a place of darkness, in a place where he's not obvious. That was the purpose of creation. Which means, therefore, that the way that we do that, or which areas in our life do we mostly accomplish that, in the routine, very physical areas of our life. The simple things, right? Which differentiates Judaism from most other religions, where religion is seen as very spiritual. In general, there's a muddling up between spiritual and God. They're not the same thing, by the way. Right? Spiritual just means, people always ask me, can I be spiritual without believing in God? I say, yes, you just can't be godly. In other words, spiritual just means I go to a deeper part of myself, a more metaphysical part, I'm experiencing something more transcendent. You can kind of think that you experience that even outside of belief in God, but you can't be godly. Because godly means actually living your life in a godly way. Not just escaping once in a while to a spiritual experience, actually living your whole life, right? And that happened in Matan Torah because the Midrash tells us that before Sinai, there was like the separation between heaven and earth, the separation between the physical and the spiritual. And it was hard to merge them. The whole idea of God revealing himself on the mountain, as the pasuk, as the verse tells us, by Yered Hashem, God descended, he came down to this world. It's not about he revealed himself in this world, it's about he gave us the gift, he gave us the ability to bring holiness into the very simple things of our life, right? And that's why specifically, Aseret HaDibrot is not about some lofty prayer or something, which is important. Spirituality is important because it fuels the desire to live in a godly way, but it's actually a means to an end. That's why in Judaism we always say that the shul is not, I'm not discouraging going to shul, please don't make a mistake, but the shul is not the headquarters of Judaism, right? The headquarters of Judaism is the home, not the shul, right? Because the home is where we live our physical life, where we live normally, where we live routine life, and to bring God into there, and to do things in a godly way, and to bring godliness into the home is much more important. Now, you need the shul to get there because you need to be focused, and you need to have time, like Shabbat. Shabbat and during the week in the way is more holy than Shabbat. If you have a Shabbat, meaning it's more holy because Shabbat gives us just the guidance and the spiritual focus and the reason why we have a weekday, which is not just to work and eat and sleep, but it's to bring godliness into all of those things, right? To bring meaning, purpose into all of those things. So that's why the Aseret HaDibrot, the Ten Commandments, obviously about faith of God and so on, and about Shabbat, which is, as we explained a few weeks ago, which is about the state of being, to reflect on why we're doing what we're doing. But really the rest of it is very simple stuff, and it's simple stuff because that's the point. The point is to bring godliness into the simple stuff, right? And that's the Dirabah Tachtonim, that's the dwelling place in this world that God is looking for. He's looking to be welcomed in, not just when you have a very deep spiritual experience in a shiur or in a drasha or in prayer or meditation, whatever the case is, but the purpose of godliness is that he should be welcomed in even to those very simple things which we call routine life experiences. That's one idea. The second idea is this, and this we're going to discuss it and break it down, how it manifests itself in this particular commandment, right? As we explained in the beginning, the giving of the Torah was about giving us a moral code. And when we say a moral code, as we explained, not a human code which is subjective morality, but like Rabbi Sachs likes to call it, an absolute morality, right? Which comes from a transcendent place and a divine source. In other words, morality from a Torah point of view is about following a code of intrinsic right and intrinsic wrong, right? I think we once explained this, that in most human societies, morality is more defined about how it's going to affect other people, how it's going to affect the society, right? And therefore, there's a notion that what I do in my private home has nothing to do with anyone else. Therefore, I can do whatever I want, right? As long as I'm not, there's this famous line: as long as I'm not hurting anyone, I'm good. Now, from a Jewish point of view, that's actually not true, because it's more about obviously it's intrinsically wrong to hurt other people. That is true, but that's not the definition of morality. The definition of morality from a godly source, from a godly point of view, is what's intrinsically right and intrinsically wrong, right? The example I gave once about this is that we have an interesting law in the Torah about cautioning us in a very, very strong way. Not, in olden times, of course, they would sell things by using scales, right? It's actually not such an ancient thing. I don't know. I remember as a kid going to the fruit store and they still had these scales, right? The pound and the weights. Yes, I mean, yeah. Right. So the Torah talks about very, very strong terms about not cheating with the weights. Like, someone wants to charge for a pound. If he makes his weight a little bit less than a pound, but charges for a pound, that's theft, obviously. And Torah, But then the Torah goes a step further. Very interesting thing. The Torah says, there's a halacha, there's a mitzvah. One of the negative commandments in the Torah is you may not keep inaccurate scales in your house. Business is closed today, but I have an inaccurate scale in my house. It's transgression. Why? Because the Torah says it's a dishonesty, which is intrinsically bad. You're not hurting anyone else, so you're actually not even using them. But the concept of a false scale, a false weight, is intrinsically bad. And you can't even keep it in your house. I'm just giving you an example of that morality is not always about how I affect other people, right? Now, because that's an absolute moral code, not one that is developed by society or the perception or the values of the society of the day, right? What happens is, that's why we have this concept that the Torah is eternal. One of the principles of Jewish faith is that the Torah is eternal. The eternity of the Torah, right? As the Rambam says, HaTorah hazot lo tiyeh mukhlefet, this Torah will never change. What does that mean? Because laws or ideas that are made to serve a particular society, of course, are not eternal. They will change. Why will they change? Because society changes, right? The Torah's laws, unless the Torah itself says so, like the Torah says there's certain things we can't do today because we don't have a temple and so on. But really, the moral code of the Torah is something which is eternal because it transcends society. It's not responding to a particular society, it transcends society, right? Why am I saying this? Because this goes back to why we have these laws, a second answer, or it's a connected answer, but why we have these laws in the Ten Commandments. Because do not kill, I'm going to give you examples soon, but do not kill is an obvious thing, right? What do we need 10 commandments for? No. The answer is that do not kill the way it's defined by God, not the way it's defined by human being. And that's where it becomes tricky. In other words, what we commit to in the 10 commandments is not the basic idea. Everyone's going to say, I'm not going to kill, obviously. I mean, if you met some guy in the street and said, would you murder? You would be horrified at such a question, right? And yet, it's not so simple. Because what's the definition of murdering? Both ways. Like we'll see that sometimes, what I want to break down, sometimes actually murdering or killing is moral. Like in a war, for example, if it's a legitimate war. We spoke about this after October the 7th a lot. Right? Self-defense, for example, and we'll see why it's like that. There's sometimes permission to kill in self-defense, which there are sanctions. And yet, on the other hand, there are certain things that we wouldn't even contemplate to be called murder, and yet maybe it is, or maybe it's part of murder, right? Which we need to understand what that means. Because the Torah, it's the Torah's definition of murder. It's the godly definition of murder. So giving the commandment and the 10 commandments is not only saying do not murder in a general sense, which obviously everyone would do anyway, most people at least, but it's more than that. It's saying commit to the absolute morality of murder. And therefore you need to explore what those values are and what that means in order to adhere to them. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, let's see. Now, let's just talk about murder, for example, first of all, in general terms. So, it's interesting that we said this last week, that some of the commentaries explain that the 5 commandments on the right correspond to the 5 commandments on the left, right? So here we see why Torah generally gives such sanctity to life, because the 6th commandment, the first on the left, which is do not murder, corresponds to Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am Hashem your God, which is the mitzvah of emunah, basically, right? So what's the connection? So we know that God tells us, we learn in the Mishnah, that every human being is created b'tselem Elokim, in the image of God. Now, that's a separate discussion exactly what that means, but bottom line what it means is, we are created with an imprint of God. The human being, unlike every other being, the human being is a spiritual or metaphysical portrait of God, right? We have the image of God imprinted on us, which is an unbelievable thing, right? Every human being. Which highlights the severity of murder. How so? So there's a midrash that says the following. There was a king who once came into a country and put up portraits of himself, right? And made statues of himself and minted coins with his image. After a while, it says the midrash, the people of the country desecrated his portraits, smashed his statues and defaced his coins. I'm just reading the midrash, right? Thereby reducing the image of the king. Right? Now this is actually a midrash explaining an explicit verse in the Torah. All the way, not even by 10 commandments, because the 7 Noachide laws were given way before the 10 commandments, right? They were given to Adam, actually. No, the reason they're called Noachide laws, just by the way, interesting little fact, is 6 of them were given to Adam, the first 6, and the 7th was given to Noach. And the reason for that is because when the world was created from Adam until Noach, the first 10 generations of existence was a time where eating meat was prohibited. Only after the flood, the Torah tells us, did God permit us to eat meat. And that's when he gave the 7th law, which is cruelty to animals, essentially embodied in the 7th Noachide law, which is not to eat flesh of a live animal. In other words, that's right. You have to actually slaughter or kill the animal first and then only take the meat. Okay. They're called Noachide laws. So one of them is murders. But when the Torah says that, and included by extension, by the way, is about injuring ourselves for no reason, the pasuk specifically says that someone who spills blood is severely guilty because the man was created in the image of God. In other words, when you kill someone, God forbid, you are defacing, you are disrespecting not just the person, not just about hurting the person, you're actually going against God and damaging God, so to speak. I mean, God can't be damaged, but the concept of defacing a godly image, a godly portrait. So you're fundamentally going against your intrinsic connection between you and God. That's lot tirtzach, right? That's why we find in Judaism that human life has an intrinsic value. This is a very, very important point. It explains many, many laws around this. Human life has an intrinsic value. We don't always appreciate this, but it does. And therefore, and it manifests itself in Jewish law in so many different ways, by the way, right? Because the way they're explaining is that murdering a person means driving God out of the world. The human being is the godly manifestation in this world. Killing someone is driving God out of the world, right? Which is why life is so sacred. And this, of course, manifests itself in Jewish law. For example, we have a law, for example, that to save a life, you can break any law, right? Now, so for example, you can break Shabbat, right? Shabbat is considered important, but you can break Shabbat to save a life. If anyone is even in potential danger, you can save a life, or prolong a life, or save a life in a right? However, what you cannot do, and this gives rise to lots of ethical questions, right? There's a whole body of study in Jewish learning, which is medical ethics, which gets discussed a lot because technology keeps on changing. So you have all these medical ethical questions, right, which are fascinating and have to be translated back into Jewish law. There's a rabbi, quite a famous rabbi called Akiva Tatz, who he was a doctor himself, then he became a rabbi, and used his medical knowledge for this. He's very, very well versed in medical ethics, and he gives a lot of good shiurim on this and fascinating stuff. I'll give you one example in a minute, but we have so there's a principle that when you break Shabbat, so you can break every mitzvah to save a life. There are 3 mitzvot you cannot break to save a life, even to save a life: idolatry, which is a cardinal sin, adultery, and murder. Right? So you cannot. Right? So this goes into a thing where there was the Gemara tells us comes from, and we learn it from different sources. The source of murder is a logical thing, well, from a Jewish point of view, a logical thing, and it came from the great sage called Rabbi, who was once was approached by someone who was running away, and he walked into and he ran into the shul, or went to the college of learning, and he asked Rabbi the following question. He says, "I'm being pursued by bandits, and they've told me that they're going to kill me unless I kill someone else in this town. Right? What do I do?" His thinking was, well, I can break any law to save my life, so that I can kill someone to save my life, right? And Rabbi said to him, very, very simply, why do you think that your blood is redder than the other person? In other words, you cannot, there's no way ever you'll explain one person's life to be better than the others. Now, why not? How about if the life of a person has a terminal illness and is the last legs and the last few, whatever it is, right? And then compared to a person who's 23 in their prime of life? No. Intrinsic life is intrinsic life. Why? Because the image of God, that's why, right? And you can break Shabbos to save, even if it's going to be a few hours of saving a person's life. You can break Shabbos if it'll help save their life. Even if you know beyond a shadow of a doubt the person is going to die tomorrow morning or somewhere in the next day or two, if you know completely, it doesn't matter. You can still break Shabbos to save their life or to prolong their life, right? Because life has an intrinsic value. Now, the laws around this are very, very, very complex, because there are sometimes that we do certain things to make someone comfortable that does shorten their life. So this is a huge topic in itself. We're not going to go there, but it does give rise to lots of different questions. So I remember one of the questions Rabbi Tass discussed, this was fascinating, I heard it very many years ago, is in South Africa there was a real question about someone that needed a ventilator. Now, not always you have to, because the halakha is when someone's at the end of their life, you have to do certain things, but you can't shorten their life unnecessarily, but you don't need to do, sometimes you don't need to do aggressive intervention, right? In other words, you let the course run its course. So you don't have to, if someone's having difficulty breathing, you don't have to hook them up to a ventilator. The only problem is if you do, you can't switch it off, right? So there was a hospital in South Africa that had, and he was asked this by a medical student, that there was a big shortage of ventilators, and the question was presented to him, I guess, this rabbi doctor, that right at that moment, there was only a very elderly woman in the hospital who needed a ventilator, who didn't have long to go. But the ventilator would give a bit more life, right? But there was statistically a really, really good chance that the next morning, someone would come into the hospital who's much younger, has a bright future ahead of them, and will need a ventilator. So what do? Right? Do we say we're not hooking up the old lady to the ventilator but that means but that's what they want, or I could save their life and whatever? Or do we hook her up and then switch her off the next morning when someone who needs it more comes, which you can't actually. That's absolutely no. Right? A whole thing. And it was I remember the details, I heard it a long time ago, but it was, and I don't know where I heard it, so I couldn't even look it up. But it was a very, very complex question. At the end, I think he came up with an incredibly creative, a pretty creative solution. It has something to do with putting on the ventilator with a time clock and then restarting it if needed. Right? Because there might be a situation where sometimes there could be two people, then the question is, how do you triage? but at least it would be a question, right? And maybe you can give it to one over the other if it's not working anymore. So anyway, I don't remember exactly how it was applied, but it was very fascinating. Where does this all come from? It all comes from this idea that you cannot compare one life to another. You're not allowed to do that, right? I mean, there is a big issue about what happens if you have to deal with two people, right? And what do you choose? How do you triage it, right? That's a really, in Jewish law, that's incredibly difficult. I mean, there's a concept of who you meet first. It's called lefanecha. If someone's in front of you, you have to deal with them situation now. They had many questions like this in the war in Israel and so on and so forth, right? So it all comes from this idea. But because sometimes you might think, okay, but anyways, I only got a few minutes. No, Lord Titzach is Lord Titzach. You cannot murder. You cannot decide whose life is more important than the others, because life has an intrinsic value. Okay. However, on the other hand, we know King Solomon says he says there's a time to love, a time to hate, a time to talk, a time to be silent, right? In Kohelet, which, as I've told you, I can't pronounce it in English. I don't know how it goes. Ecclesiastes or something, right? We have it in front of me, so I can actually pronounce it. Okay. So King Solomon says there, a time to love, a time to hate, a time to talk, a time to be silent. And then he says a time for war, a time for peace, a time to kill, a time to heal. In other words, sometimes the same Torah that says that murder is a terrible thing, even if it's for a few minutes, even if it's an old person that doesn't function, even if it's a person with no quality of life, whatever the case is, and you're guilty of the same murder, if you kill them, doesn't matter what their quality of life was, right? But the Torah says, it's a time to kill. Sometimes killing is moral. It's not a nice thing to do. Jacob didn't want to do it. I told you, he prayed to God that he shouldn't have to kill Esav. But he had to pray to God, please, I'm very worried that I might have to kill, because there might be a situation that if Esau comes and he confronts me, I'm going to morally have to kill him to save my family. Because self-defense is a time when you're allowed to kill. Why that is, so the commentaries explain, because if a person's coming after you to kill you, he has already banished the godly image from himself, because killing is such an ungodly thing, and the person that's running after you to kill you, like, why don't you apply the same principle? Who says my life's better than his? Right? That's an interesting question. Well, how come you're allowed to kill for self-defense if we're saying that we can't compare lives? Because every life is intrinsic. But why is every life intrinsic? Because it's got the image of God. So we learn, we wouldn't be able to make this up ourselves, but we're given guidelines from the Torah that you can kill for self-defense, because that person he's killing you, so he's already taken God out of himself, so to speak. It sometimes applies, sometimes doesn't apply. I'm not getting into the intricacies halachically, but there are times where killing is moral, and that's okay. Israel is fighting a war which is a moral war. They're the most moral army in the world, right? And we should be proud of that. We should know that. It's not a nice thing to do. It's not a nice thing to happen. But yes, Israel has killed. They've tried their best to avoid civilians. War brings a price where you can't always do that. And it's a moral war. It's a moral killing, right? And there's something that, I guess, psychologically, that the chayalim, the soldiers, the holy soldiers, need to understand and appreciate. And I think they do. It's not an easy thing to go into battle. It's not an easy thing to kill, but it's not a nice thing. We pray we shouldn't have to do that. But sometimes that's a moral thing. Why? Because the whole thing is godly. It's not about what I think. It's not about how I logically make it up. It's about what's the intrinsic good and the intrinsic bad. So I'll give you an interesting example, an interesting experience that I had around this example. This was way back. I don't remember what it was actually. It was a number of years ago. You might remember the story. There's a guy called Mr. Goodall. I think he lived in Perth or Adelaide, maybe, I don't remember. Anyway, he was born in London, and he grew up, and he was very old. He was 104. And you remember the story? He was not terminally ill actually, but he just started to deteriorate. 104 is a little old. And he couldn't walk so well, he couldn't see so well, whatever the case. But he was completely with it and everything. Very, very able to make decisions. And because he was not terminally ill, there was no solution of a sister dying here in Australia at the time. And I think laws changed now, but whatever the case is. But in Switzerland, there was a law that a person who's not terminally ill, in fact, specifically not terminally ill, because they had all their wits about them and they can make proper decisions, they can actually decide that their quality of life is no longer viable, and they can decide to die. Okay. So he did. He traveled there. And the way it worked was, I remember following the story, the way it worked was that they set him up and everything, and then they set him up with an IV, with a substance, which the person himself has to administer. So he has to press the thing. And then the famous line that he said, his last line was, "Why is this taking so long?" Right? Anyway, but okay, he was completely with it, right? But he decided to go, he had enough. Now, truth is, if you think about it, logically, it's not such a bad argument. He lived a good life, over 100, did many, many good things. He really wasn't functioning properly. He hated it the way he was functioning. So, time to go. Why not? But the problem is this, right? No, but so the truth is, from a Jewish perspective, that is murder. That's just murder. That's what it is. Right? He didn't go out and shoot someone. He didn't even shoot himself. He just, went to the hospital bed, set him up nicely, and heard some music and ate his last meal that he liked, and then he pressed the button. It's actual murder, that, right? In fact, I'll tell you a fascinating thing, because I've asked this question many times about the Jewish view on people taking their own life and suicide, right? We should know that today we have much more awareness of mental health, so therefore actually we treat them as normal people because we say that an illness killed them, right? If you want to know what real suicide is, this story. This is real suicide. Yes, suicide is murder, sure. I mean, it doesn't carry the capital punishment penalty, obviously, because the person not here anymore. But same idea, because you're taking a life. It doesn't really belong to you. It's God's life, right? But if you want to know the definition of suicide, this story. If this person would have been Jewish, which he wasn't, we might, I don't know what the rabbis would rule, but we might have to go back to the original understanding of suicide is that they treat it differently in terms of the way you bury them and all that kind of stuff. But that's real, right? It was nothing else but a conscious decision. Now, I'm not judging him. I understand he was doing it tough. But in essence, it was a very measured out, conscious decision. Why? Because lacking the absolute morality. And it's a hard thing because sometimes these issues of like I'm not functioning like I used to. It's 104 years old. I've done enough. I've done my thing. I've accomplished what I need to accomplish. So it's hard. It's a hard process. But from an absolute morality point of view, it's a hard thing. And it's forbidden, right? So I remember just at the time, I was asked, it wasn't specifically to do with the story, but I was asked a little bit afterwards to come speak to Mariah, a year 11 class. It was the thing, everyone was very happy. Like it was the thing of, everyone thought this was fantastic and why they don't do this in Australia and all this kind of stuff. So I went to talk to Mariah. There's a subject they study called Studies of Religion, right? And anyway. And one of the teachers asked me to come speak to a year 11 group to talk about the Jewish definition of ethics and morality. Like kind of what we're discussing here. So I went there and I told the story and I asked for a show of hands, who thinks it was a good thing? And not surprisingly, most of the people put up their hand and thought it was a great thing. So I said to them, let me ask you a question. Why do you think it was a good thing? He said, well, they gave me the argument. He was old, he was this. I said, how about if he was 90 and not 104? Yeah, same thing. Pretty. I said, how about if he'd be 40? 40, there's something wrong with him, whatever, he's just weak, he doesn't like life. So, no, I'm not sure. Maybe not. Maybe it's not a good thing. Maybe it is a good thing. So I asked him, so where are you going to draw the line? Like, when are you going to decide that it's an immoral thing or are you going to decide it's a moral thing? And the answer is you can't, right? Once you start with that, then there's no end, right? And that's what absolute morality means. We actually can't decide these things on our own. Because you know what? We don't know. We can actually only defer, which I think is sometimes difficult, but actually extremely liberating, because we're relying on a higher source of information. We can defer to definitions that we didn't make up. Because if we make up the definitions, we're always going to self-doubt. So 40 is not okay, but then 45 is? No. 65, 90. I mean, how are you going to, like, a little bit sick, very sick, like, how are you going to make it up, right?
People that commit suicide or this euthanasia, they get buried in the sand.
Yeah, they do nowadays, because, oh, so I don't know, that story is an interesting story. That was like a conscious decision, the person to kill himself, which is interesting. I don't know if it's legal here now, but it's a real problem, right? So that's why assisted dying, and that's becoming more and more legal in Australia, is a real problem, halachically. Yeah.
How does the living will translate into...
Okay, so it's a very complicated question. I actually wanted to avoid that today, but anyway. No, but it is, because, so it's a very, very big, so there are things, okay, so let me define it this way. Living will is like do not resuscitate and all that kind of stuff, right? So there is a concept of living will because there's a gray area, right? But actually, halachically, there's certain things we're not permitted to put into our living will, right? And then there's some things we are. So, for example, notwithstanding the sanctity of life, right? But there are situations where we are permitted to withhold certain things. To withhold, right? You don't always have to resuscitate someone. And it's very complicated, the guidelines, but there are guidelines, right? Now, some of those guidelines are a bit disputed, it depends which halachic authority you refer to. Okay, but which is normal, but there are things that we're not allowed to withhold, there are things that we can withhold. And therefore, that's where living will would come into, that a person would do there are people, by the way, that say in the living will that whatever is done needs to be in consultation with Rabbi X or halachic authority X, whatever. And if he's not around, someone else, right? That kind of thing, because it's sometimes very grey and very nuanced and very complicated, and the person wants that to happen. But a person, there are times where a person could say that in certain situations, I don't want to be resuscitated, where it's halachically permissible not to. Now, some people would say, no, I do want to, because I want you to prolong my life as much as possible. I know people that have done that have gone beyond what Allah expects, and that was their decision. That's fine, which is halachically not encouraged, but it's condoned to extend it more than you actually have to, right? And again, there's different opinions, so you have to choose which halachic authority you choose and things like that. But so the short answer to the question is that in essence, a halachic will needs to be made, a living will has to be made halachically, in consultation with someone who knows the stuff really well, and can guide a person of how to make a living will that way. Because of the sanctity of life, right? And by the way, life, and this is not the topic of this discussion, life is defined until the neshama leaves the body, which means until a person stops functioning, which we'll talk about in a second. And life begins at birth, right? Now, that's a whole other discussion, because halachically, actually, life in this situation believes with birth, right? That doesn't mean that abortion is permitted, it's not. But it's not, I think I've told this before, that the movements in America, the two extreme movements, are both wrong. My body, my choice is actually incorrect. It's not your body, it's not your choice. Your body belongs to God, and your choice belongs to God too. So, if you are deferring to a high morality system. However, the pro-lifers are also not completely right, because actually there is a difference between an unborn child and a born child, and that's why in certain circumstances it's permissible. For example, and this is a very clear example of how they're different. So the halacha is that notwithstanding that you cannot commit murder in order to save a life, but if a fetus is threatening the mother's life, you can terminate the pregnancy. Clearly, that's clear, right? There are more grey areas, like what does it mean threatening the life sometimes in mental health situations, whatever, that's a different discussion. But let's say there's a physiological, medical issue. I know a woman who was very religious who unfortunately later on she died. But she was diagnosed with cancer when she was pregnant, and the doctors were very, very clear that if she doesn't abort the pregnancy, she will die much sooner. And all the rabbis told her she has to, right? However, if a human being is threatening you or saving a baby, once the baby is born, you can't do that anymore, right? Even if some hypothetical case where someone else needs to die in order for you to live, you can't do it anymore, because that's killing the other person for you. So I'm saying an unborn child is not exactly the same, right? Now, I'll give you another example. I want to do quickly, because I want to actually finish with a spiritual understanding of this mitzvah. Another very unbelievable thing, and again, this is not a discussion for now, and it's a very, very broad topic, but is the whole, and halakha looks at every new idea and tries to decipher, interpret the original halakha to see how it applies, right? When organ transplants came in, so a whole new body of halachic research came about, because the question is, when is the moment of death? No one ever worried about that, really. I mean, a person was dead when they were dead. You have to wait a few minutes to make sure, okay, but all of a sudden that became a hot topic. What is the halachic definition of death? Now, you go back, the way it works, you go back to the Talmud. There is a situation where the Talmud sort of discusses it, depends on what it means, and there's different schools of thought. But just to give you an example what this means, right? Again, what the sanctity of life means. And God's in charge of when life ends, ultimately. We are supposed to do everything we can to preserve life, but the moment of death is his. But the question is, what is the moment of death? So a person has a car crash, a young person, right? It doesn't matter, but I'm saying a good heart. And they're brain dead, but their heart's still beating, which is what you need for a heart transplant, right? The question is that considered death, right? Now, in that simple example, if he's halachically dead, then taking his heart and not burying it and giving it to another person who desperately needs a new heart is a huge mitzvah. You're saving a life, correct? You're just transgressing the sin of not burying a person, but that's one of the things you can just break the Torah in order to save a life. That's fine. In fact, not only fine, it's a mitzvah, right? However, the problem is if he's not halachically dead, which is why you have to determine what is halachic death, you're actually guilty of murder if you take that heart, right? Because murder is not about stabbing someone in the street. Murder is about stopping a person's life whenever it's called life.
But what makes it halachically dead?
So the question is it brain dead or is it respiratory death, which has got to do with the heartbeat? Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so there are many people today that happens, especially with technology, that you have often a case where a person there's no activity in the stem cell, whatever they call it, and there's no brain activity. Okay, which is also complicated because there's all kinds of tests you have to run to make sure that's absolutely the case. But let's say you can. Many opinions will say it's considered dead. That's what common medicine determined, because they also went through that process of defining what death is, and that was their conclusion. I mean, just to make it more complicated, there's no actually conclusion on this. There's two schools of thought in the rabbinic halachic world, which is fine, and a person can follow whatever they want. But so that's another. But it just goes to show you about the sanctity of life. In other words, you have a person that really has no function other than his heart is beating. But it could be that he's still alive, and if he's still alive, then you have to preserve that. You can't just say, well, he's going to die anyway in a couple of days, and he has no function, because that's the sanctity of life. That's the meaning of this mitzvah, and that's why it's not just a mitzvah, do not murder. It's do not murder in a absolute moral way, which is guided by the Torah values and the halacha, right? However, like every mitzvah, it spills over and extrapolates, and I want to just finish with this, to another aspect of murder, which is much more, not technical murder, but spiritual murder or emotional murder, and something fascinating about what the Talmud says. Talmud says about not murdering someone because a person is created in the image of God includes not emotionally assassinating someone and preserving the dignity of every human being as much as possible. Right? Therefore, the Talmud says an unbelievable thing and says, "Hamalbin pnei chavero barabim." If someone publicly humiliates someone in public, especially, where the person is completely ashamed and embarrassed, that is like murder. Like murder. In fact, the Talmud goes as far as to say, and it's a debate whether it means literally or just trying to make a point, it's better to be thrown into the furnace of the fire, and we learn this from a whole story in the Chumash, than embarrass someone else in public. Right? Because, and this is where you get the deeper side, not just the absolute technical morality side of the Ten Commandments, which is one idea which we just spoke about, but you also get this concept of the deeper side of what these commandments also mean. Right? Embarrassing someone is like murdering them. In fact, the language used is hamalbin. Hamalbin means to whiten someone, to make someone white. Because apparently when someone gets embarrassed, they get very red, but then their blood drains and they get pale. Right? So it's like spilling their blood. But spilling their blood because to undermine the dignity of another human being is, from a Torah perspective, from a Jewish perspective, is considered like murder. It's considered like, it's a terrible sin. And that's why in halakha we have many, many times where there are leniencies in halakha to do with what we call kavod habriyot, the dignity of people, which we're not going to go into now, but there is that concept. And there's just that awareness of trying to build that awareness and that consciousness about how important the dignity of another person is. Now, sometimes we can inadvertently do it. It's sometimes a hard mitzvah to keep, but it's such an awareness we have to have that this respect for another life is not only respect for life in terms of preserving physical life, but it's preserving their emotional life and preserving their shame and their dignity, and not to undermine that. And we see this with some great people, how they went to great lengths to be sensitive. It's about becoming sensitive and really being aware about what we do that might undermine the dignity of another person. I'll just tell you 3 stories, just I saw, which are beautiful. So there was a young boy in Jerusalem. Let me tell you who the tzaddik was. There was a very, very famous Rosh Hashiva in Israel called Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. He was a great halachic authority, but he was also very, very, he was known for his amazing love of other people and respect for other people and so on. And he was a very busy person. People used to come to him with questions all the time. He headed a yeshiva. Anyway, there was a young boy in Jerusalem who struggled reading, but he decided to be very determined, and he's going to take upon himself to learn the Haftarah for his bar mitzvah. All right? So the father hired a teacher, a very skilled teacher, in order to do this, worked for months, and mastered it. He mastered it. The few days before the Shabbat, the bar mitzvah teacher, in horror, realized that he made a mistake. He taught him the wrong Haftarah. Now, why is that? Because, I'll tell you why it happened. No, these things can happen, by the way. It once happened to me as, not to me personally, I'm saying to a boy I was doing my mitzvah for. Which on the spot, I had to make a decision without researching it, and thank God I made the right decision. I'll tell you the story when we finish this. But so anyway, could happen because every Shabbat has a Haftarah, right? But there are times that we change the Haftarah in certain circumstances. For example, if you have a Shabbat, which has, let's say, Shabbat Parsha, the Parsha of this week, right? But let's say the day after Shabbat is Rosh Chodesh. So it happens to be that when the day after Shabbat is Rosh Chodesh, there's a different Haftarah. Yeah. And the teacher looked up, your mitzvah is on so and so, it means the next Shabbat is this Parsha, I'll teach you this Parsha of Haftarah. And didn't realize, didn't make a point to make sure that if there's any changes that Shabbat. Right? And there were. The next day was Rosh Chodesh, so it's a different Haftarah, so you know what to do. So the father or the teacher, they ran to Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who on the spot said, and there was a halachic basis for this, it's not the thing you would normally do, but he says, can you imagine what happens if you tell the boy that he can't do the Haftarah now? You keep the Haftarah that he learns. Keep the Haftarah that he learns. Now, not always that's so simple. If something is categorically forbidden, you might have to find a different way to go around it and to preserve the dignity, but I'm just saying the approach, right? Okay, so they said, no. Shabbos morning, they gather in shul, and within a few minutes of starting the service, who walks in? Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. It's not his shul. He comes to the shul. So the rabbi walks over, the chazan, the father, the people, they run over. Shlomo Zalman, what do we honor this thing? And he said to them, he says like this. He said, it was the teacher. The teacher of the boy ran over. He says, what do we owe this honor? So he said, listen, I suspected that some people are going to challenge my ruling. They're going to doubt if I ever said such a thing. It's going to cause a bit of a commotion when the boy gets up and starts the wrong Haftarah. So to save the boy from any humiliation, I researched where the laning would take place and decided to attend in person to halt any objections. That's how you think. If you have that mindset, that's how you think. I'll tell you another beautiful story with just 3 stories that I was thinking about. There's an institution headed by someone in Miami called Aleph Institute in America. It's been going for many, many, many years. Also, it's a really institution based around preserving dignity for people because it deals with prisoners, Jewish prisoners. It's about really an advocacy group for Jewish prisoners. It's about visiting them. It's about giving them, make sure they have kosher food. And it's also about giving them hope. I mean, some people have to go to prison, they can do a crime, whatever, but it's about really, that kind of thing. So there was a group of 18, I think, of prisoners that this was a time still when the Rebbe was alive, that he managed to get permission. It was obviously a white-collar crime thing. That this head of the institution, Rabbi Lipsky, his name was, in Miami, he since passed away. His son runs it now. It's a big organization, a huge organization now. That he got permission to be able to take 18 of these white-collar prisoners out of prison for a weekend and give them a real experience, a Jewish experience, a Shabbat experience, and the whole thing, under, I guess, some sort of supervision and rules, whatever the case was. And they brought them to 770. I was actually there that Shabbat. I just don't remember the story. I heard the story afterwards because no one knew the story. And, the people knew that they're coming, and obviously they looked a little bit different to a normal long black coat carrying Lubavitcher kind of thing, and people knew they were there. Okay. Friday, so the plan was that we're going to give them shiurim and lectures and learn with them and beautiful Shabbat meals. And then Shabbat afternoon, they would join the Rebbe's Farbrengen. The Rebbe always used to have a Farbrengen on Shabbat afternoon, where the place would pack into the place was very, very packed, and the Rebbe would sit on a table, he would eat, and people would listen. And it was sometimes hard to find a place, it was tricky. So Friday afternoon, Rabbi Groner, the secretary of the Rebbe, comes looking for Rabbi Lipska. He says, where's Rabbi Lipska? I need to talk to him very urgently. So he came to Rabbi Lipska and says, what can I do? He says, the Rebbe asked me to send a message to you that at the Farbrengen tomorrow, they should not sit as a group. They must be dispersed all over the place. So he says, but I've already organized and I've got people to hold a place for them and it's very tricky. He says, no, the Rebbe said like this. He said, he explained that two things he said. He said that if they seated together, the Rebbe had said that people will ask who they are, right? Because not everyone knew that this was happening. I mean, a couple of people knew, but it will be said that they are prisoners, and this will be embarrassing to them. To prevent this from happening, they should be seated separately, not to draw attention. Then the Rebbe said that normally at the end of the Farbrengen, he would sometimes give to the guests or people who were coming or going other places, he would hand out like a bottle of vodka or something that you take to their place and give l'chaim, whatever. And the Rebbe said that he was not going to give a bottle to this group, although they were most deserving of this extra concern, because again, this would attract attention and their identity would be revealed. Rather than the risk in causing them embarrassment, the Rebbe preferred not to give them the bottle. Instead, he said he will lift their spirits by including in that Farbrengen concepts that will be very inspiring for them. That was the idea, right? Which he did. Again, it's just thinking ahead about how we can preserve the dignity of someone. I'll tell you one final story, which I think I told you many, many years ago. And we'll end with this. Also a beautiful story. There was a rabbi, before the state of Israel was even established. There was a rabbi in Jerusalem, a very famous rabbi. He was the head rabbi of the Haredi community at the time. His name was Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, also a very great person. And his shul, every single Rosh Hashanah, there was a chazan who would daven Musaf, a very beautiful chazan, beautiful tunes, and for years and years and years. One year, shortly after the Chagim, he got, in the middle of the year sometime, he got ill and he passed away. Okay, which is devastating. And comes closer to Rosh Hashanah, and the Gabaim, the board, the committee, I don't know how it works in those shuls, they went over to the rabbi who ran the show, and they said to him, who's going to be the chazan for Musaf this year? I mean, for the last 30 years we had this chazan, right? So he said, you'll find out. Erev Rosh Hashanah, it's like urgent. I mean, you need to know, right? Who's going to be the chazan? They go over to the rabbi, said, don't worry about it, you'll find out. Everyone came to shul the next day, not knowing who the chazan is going to be for Musaf, right? Which is the main prayer of Rosh Hashanah. Comes, they blow the shofar. Just before the shofar, which was just before Musaf, Yosef Chaim leaves his place and he walks over to the son of the chazan, and he said, "You're going to down." Okay. He says, "I'm sure. I don't know if I'm worthy." He says, "Listen, you stood enough years next to your father. You learned all the tunes. You'll be okay. You go down." Now, the concept here was the following: if you're not regularly a chazan and you're in a year of mourning, you're actually on Shabbat and the Chag, you're not supposed to do that. Right? You're not supposed to lead the congregation. If someone's already a chazan, it's like an appointed chazan, then you're allowed to, because you don't display public mourning on Shabbos, and therefore everyone will realize, he's not davening because he wants. But if you're not anyways a chazan, you're not supposed to lead the congregation on a Chag, unless there's some really good reason for it, right? So after Rosh Hashanah, there was a little bit of the rabbi's a great rabbi, but yeah. So some people went to talk to him about this, to find out, first of all, why it was okay. Second of all, why didn't he tell anyone then, right? So he said like this, he said, can you imagine? He said, just think about this. This is what he was thinking about, right? He wasn't thinking about the best chazan for the shul. He was thinking about something else. He said, can you imagine, Musaf and Rosh Hashanah, the widow is sitting in the women's section, and suddenly the moment comes and just some stranger goes over to be the chazan. Can you imagine how devastated she's going to be? So I was thinking about how can we give her some comfort? And I know that there's a problem, but I found a way, halachically there's room, if it's a real need and all that, that's okay. So I decided that the only comfort I can give to her is for her own son to fill that place. I didn't say it before because I knew people are going to challenge me. Every chacham is going to come and say, but it's not so good, there's maybe someone else that can do it better. Halachically, it's a chag. So I said, you'll see. And by doing that, I was able to save the dignity of that woman, which is amazing. But it's a different way of thinking. In other words, we put ourselves in one mode sometimes, right? That we got a chazan. Okay, so who's going to be the chazan? What's best for the shul? Who's going to be the best singer, right? He was in a different place. He was thinking about something else completely. How are we going to save the widow pain, right? And that's the spiritual application of do not murder. In other words, preserve, which is also in the positive. Don't undermine the dignity of someone else, but also preserve the dignity of other people. We have to try. It's not so easy to be like these great people, but we can certainly try. See you next week.